Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of this conference hosted by Revo Hub. So Revo Hub is a collective that represents and connects the next generation of professionals with the retail, leisure and placemaking community that is Revo. And it's our job to kind of look to the future of this industry. Grigor and I are both on the Revo Hub committee. My name's Gina. I'm an architect at Threesixty Architects based up in Glasgow. We do town centre, city centre visions based on retail repurposing.
And I'm Grigor from Make Architects. We work across the full range of retail property across the world.
And today we're talking about the enigma that is Generation C. So quite a few of you might be wondering, what is Gen C? So it's known as the Centennial generation, so people born around the turn of the century, but it's not really just a generation that is defined by age. It's really about attitudes and behaviours and how they manifest in the way people interact with the world. So this could be, you know, the aspect of hyperconnectivity, community, consciousness and control over their lives. And these attributes are often associated with younger members of society, but it's not always the case. So understanding the kind of boundaries of this demographic group is really, really important for people that are making the places of the future. It's crucial for those organisations to kind of understand these differences. So we've put together a panel of experts who are going to be talking about all things Generation C. But before we get started, as this conference is about human-centric placemaking, we wanted to start off with 3 real-life anecdotes of people that kind of look at the kind of challenges and opportunities that are distinct and unique to Gen Z. So I'll hand over to Grigor.
Okay, so story 1 is called the digital identity. So at Make Architects, we often have work experience students. So those are kids at school between, say, 12 and 17 who come over to learn about the architectural profession, see if they want to be architects. And as we get to know them, they tell us a bit about their lives. And one of them told us how much they love playing Fortnite. For those of you who don't know, and I apologize if this is common knowledge, Fortnite is a mass online action adventure and world building game where you sign up, you get a character, and then you interact with loads of other people from across the world in this world. The game is free to play, but if you want to have a customizable character, something that's unique to you, you have to spend real money, in the order of 20 to 30 pounds, depending on how rare the character is or how desirable it is. And when we spoke to the student and we asked him, so if you had 30 pounds to spend on yourself in the real world, or on your character in Fortnite, without even thinking, they said, well, actually, I'll spend it on the character. Why is that? Because the character represents them to a much larger audience globally, and is, at the time of their life, that's where they were spending a lot of their time, whereas their physical self is only visible by, say, 20 or 30 friends in their immediate community. So that was a lot more important to them.
So what are the key issues here with this character that Grigor's explained? Is the cost of living in the real world actually going to produce more of a shift to the digital, where people can have more control over how they interact with each other and how they express their own identity? Is the kind of clone shopping malls and retail parks creating a disconnection from Gen C and the physical place? Is the rise of kind of online workplace, online education really kind of exacerbating that? And how do we invite this generation to have an emotional connection to the places that are local to them? And then co-creation, can we borrow ideas from the gaming world, from this kind of new technology, to really make the design and modification of the physical environment more interesting for this generation? Can it be more intuitive, more exciting? And has the panel seen any examples of that in play?
Okay, story 2 is titled Escaping the 15-Minute City. So I have a friend who lives in North Greenwich, which is to your left, and he works in the City of London in a tech company to your right. Within his reach are pretty much all the facilities, amenities, leisurely activities that a city can offer, both at his workplace and near his home place. Whether that's to do with shopping, with sports, with outdoor activities, or whether it's to do with culture, learning, food experiences. anything you can think of, he kind of has at his doorstep. So you could say he lives in the 15-minute city, or the widespread definition of that, where you can reach pretty much everything you need within a short distance through walking or public transport. Is that where he chooses to spend his time and disposable income? Not exactly. He was telling me how this summer he went on a digital nomad retreat in Portugal. What this is it's a farm with loads of bungalows which have really good Wi-Fi, and people from all over the world go there to spend a month or a couple of months working for their employers across the world remotely, but in the meantime participating in cooking classes and wellness workshops and taking strolls in nature and admiring the stars. And when I asked him what he liked about it, why did he do that? Why did he need to go to Portugal when he's living in central London? He said he's missing two things there. The first one is this calm and access to nature, being able to just get away from things, get away from your daily environment. And the second aspect was the social connections, the fact that in a small tribe-like group, you could form connections with new people a lot quicker than you could do when you are actually in a dense, busy city where you're surrounded by people all the time, but not necessarily have the time or the energy to connect with them, and neither they have that.
So again, the key issues, this connection to nature, we all know how important this is. It's something that was mentioned earlier in session 1. Have the panel seen any great examples of urban environments that can foster a greater connection to nature, a greater connection to each other, to kind of increase that social benefit of the places that we live? Secondly, is there a kind of negative mental health and well-being aspect to living in very highly commercialized spaces where you have to spend money to actually spend time and dwell in a place? And has there been any good examples of space, public free space, that is about interaction rather than transaction? Again, something that came up in the last session. And lastly, recent decades have seen a decline in kind of civic engagement and in community organisation. So what does Gen Z need to build community? Is it a shift away from more traditional living, working models? We'll see in the panel.
Third story is called the values gap. I apologize, I don't know why that happens. I think it's my breathing. So my sister is 20 years old, and she and her friends' main source of information about the world is the internet in its various forms, social media, YouTube, various platforms. And what that means is they're really well connected to all the issues of the world, and they're very well aware of the environmental and social challenges we're facing as humanity, and they want to be responsible, they want to be good citizens, they want to do the right thing. And that informs their value systems, and I think values have been spoken about quite a bit already. But what happens is those same values then get subverted by those same platforms, whereas one second you're looking at the world burning, and the next second you can buy some really nice sandals or other garments. And this is designed to make you click on those things and buy them. And my sister admits that she's often subverted by the clever ways that the advertising and the marketing on this platform works. And so she ends up in this situation where she has these values and they get broken by the kind of same source. Her physical environment looks a lot like this, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. There are lots of multinational brands which all send the right messages but have quite opaque processes behind them. So what is the respite? What is she trying to do to follow her values? Well, she tries to repair some of her clothes. So the picture to the left is a fast fashion jacket which she really likes, but which started falling apart after a year. Did she try to buy a new one? No, she tried to repair it with super glue, as you can see, to questionable results. She tries to shop at kind of off the beaten track places. Those could call those pre-loved fashion or thrift shops or secondhand stores, whichever flavor you like of that. But it's effectively not buying things that are already there, not things that have just been produced. And lastly, trying to very rarely shop from places which produce the things in front of you, or failing that, looking at videos of producing your own types of garments. In this instance here, it's how to make Barbie socks using a basic pair of Nike white socks. And that's a video on TikTok.
So the key issues here to summarise is how can we create physical and digital spaces that allow Gen Z and everyone to live according to their values. Going back to that local question that we've been talking about, something we'd ask the panel to think about. Are cities and urban centres the most sustainable place for ethical consumption? Is that where you can get your locally sourced, your public transport accessed places where you can be as socially conscious as possible? And then lastly, the kind of scary one, the one that was mentioned as well, greenwashing. It's a really prevalent issue in the retail world. Is it more prevalent with online retail where you can hide behind a shiny, beautiful looking website? And how can we prove that real commitment to supply chain sustainability on a social, environmental and economic basis?
So as you can probably see, these are quite complex and interlinked issues, and to help us with discussing them, we have a fantastic panel which is well versed both physically and digitally, and it will be chaired by Stephen Kainth. Stephen has worked for many well-known brands on their go-to-market strategy, and he's currently building the City of Lunaria, which is an online platform questioning what is the meaning of a city? What is a city from a digital perspective? So no small task there. So with that, it's over to you, Stephen, and the panel. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Grigor. And yeah, round of applause. So thank you, Gina and Grigor, for this introduction, and for Revo for hosting this panel. I'd like to start off with just briefly introducing the panel. So to my right, we have
Olaide.
Olaide. My pronunciation is terrible. I don't want to get it wrong. She's the Executive Director of Socius, a B Corp accredited purpose-driven developer. Next to her, we have Hannah Smith, who is a managing consultant from the data and technology consultancy CACI. Or do you pronounce it CACI?
Nobody says yeah.
Okay, cool. Then we have Koral, who is the founder of the Ready House, which is a leading creative agency that works at the intersection of content, commerce, and culture. And finally, over at the end, we have Eloise Ladkin, who's an asset manager from Cadogan, where she manages the vibrant King's Road. So that's just a quick introduction to the panel. Before we start, we've been assembled here for all of you today, so we want to deliver as much value as we possibly can for you. So instead of just exclusively asking audience questions at the end, I'd like to encourage you to participate in the conversation. If you hear something that you agree with or disagree with, please cheer or boo, so we can get a sense of your response to what we're saying, and feel free to interject in that conversation. I think there is a microphone that'll be going around. Chloe has it at the back there, so just put your hand up or grab our attention. So our goal today is really to discuss and hopefully demystify the changes in behavior that we're seeing from Gen Z, Gen C even. This is an audience that I believe will shift from spending approximately 50 hours a week in front of a screen today to almost 100% of our waking hours in front of a digital layer when we start to see the advent of augmented reality smart glasses, which according to Meta's leaked roadmap will be available around 2027. And they're expecting to see mass scaling of that towards the end of this decade. That's not a very long time if you think about it. And the key aspect of that technology scaling isn't going to be necessarily its augmented reality features. It's actually the health benefits those devices will provide. There'll be biometric devices that can monitor your health in real time, and it will really create this explosion with the whole quantified self movement. If anybody wears any fitness trackers, Apple Watches, you probably know how much time you spend looking at them, checking various health data and stats. So, with that in mind, I'd like to start off with first question, and it was related to story one that Grigor talked about. I'm a father. I have a 14-year-old daughter. Olaide, I know you have a daughter who's also is very similar age, and I'd like to pose this question to you first. So we know the digital identities of the next generation are, in some cases, more valuable in the virtual or digital world than in the real world. Does this mean the physical world is going to need to resemble the virtual world?
I don't think so. I think what the physical world and digital world are playing different roles. I think what we saw in Grigor's example was that Generation C feel that immediate connectivity to a broader group of people in the digital world, and I think that's okay. I think some people who are not Generation C fear that because they worry about the scale of connectivity and what issues of that might bring. Whereas I think if you look at that positively, it means that Generation C are global rather than just local. They are really well engaged with issues that are happening in different parts of the world, and they are much more connected. So I think the physical world has a different role to play in that. I think the physical world is about human connectivity, and it's about more depth of connection rather than the digital. So I think they play completely different roles, and they shouldn't try to emulate one another. We shouldn't try to emulate the digital world and the physical.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're starting to see some really interesting patterns, however. For example, my daughter, about a year or so ago, went to a birthday party, and instead of a partying bag, they were given Robux, a little sort of voucher for Robux, the digital currency that you can use in Roblox. And when you ask kids, why do you want that compared to like a normal physical object? To Grigor's point, it's this question of, well, I have 30,000 followers in the game, whereas I only have 12 friends in the real world. So actually, where is their attention being spent? I totally agree with what you said. I don't think the digital world the physical world should not emulate the digital world. But are we forcing behaviors in a certain way that will naturally encourage these behaviors? I think thinking about the future, it's just going to be weird. Quite simply, just weird compared to what we're used to today.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm a developer, and our bread and butter is creating places and thinking about how people are going to live in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And, the rise of, a lot of us are very screen-based. We're either walking around cities and towns on our phone looking down, and we suddenly think, actually, how do we encourage us to look up? What are the look-up moments? What are the points that pull you through a space? And we're having to work a lot harder because we are very distracted. All of us, we're distracted by things that are happening, whether it's our watch, our phone. So the urban environment is having to work harder to grab attention and to keep people's attention and to maintain people through a space. So the physical world is having to think about, how does it compete with the attention that's been given by all of us to that digital device, whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Some really good points there. Eloise, if we come to you, I spent this morning on the King's Road, and I know that's one of the areas that you look after, and there's some really phenomenal retail in that, along that road. Tell us more about what experience means and how you're engaging a younger audience who may spend more time in front of their devices than actually looking around what's in front of them.
So obviously the estate, Cadogan estate is a 300-year-old estate, and as much as we appreciate the world's changing, we've been trying to keep up with change that whole time. And myself, so asset manager on the King's Road, we are always reaching out to brands who are speaking to us, who are eager to do something different, and they're going to bring out pull out all the stops for what they want to show in their space. We've seen some brilliant examples recently of, for instance, Rixo's new store, which is their UK flagship. They have a bar, a bridal section, a vintage area, and a coffee bar as well. So as much as the primary product is ladies' wear, you're coming there to experience the brand in multiple touch points. So the businesses that we're working with and our retail tenants are so sensitive and aware of how much they need to meet that customer this end of the journey, the tangible end of the journey. We've also spoken about earlier Soho Home. They also have a coffee shop and a bar within their space as well. And I suppose it's allowing the customer to feel welcome at the entire experience that they're there for, regardless of if they're 90% of their experience of the brand had been online until that moment. You know, if you're taking with the final step and where the deal is made, where you come and make the purchase, that's the lasting moment of the brand. And that's what we're really working to make sure is that all of our tenants fully get that. They need to cooperate with that connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most overused words in our industry is the word experiential. You know, everything has to be experiential. And I'd love to get all of your perspectives on that. You know, what does experiential retailing or property development mean to each of you? So you've already sort of highlighted or touched upon that, Eloise. I don't know if you want to elaborate further.
No, I can. A development on the King's Road that we're bringing to market shortly is one called the Gaumont, which is 7 retail units, rooftop bar, 47 residential apartments and 3 office floors. And one side of that street is on Chelsea Manor Street. It fringes King's Road and Chelsea Manor Street. And we're going to be bringing creative uses to that. And we're using this development as an opportunity to reach out to businesses and customers in a new way, you know, as the scenarios that we've talked through, how you can feel so much more connected to the community. And I think any development opportunities we have, we're using that to look forwards. You know, everyone's goals are changing in terms of development, but we're always making sure that we're reaping the benefits of the space we're getting and listening to the community for their feedback on what we should provide.
Great. Koral, I know your business focuses on thinking about you know, culture and content in context, which is really important. So when we're thinking about the physical world, you know, what does that word experiential mean to you, and how does that link with what people are doing on their devices?
Yes, so it's quite interesting when we talk about experiential, because I think a lot of people see that sometimes as one-off siloed kind of things. Now, I think one thing that we kind of preach is the idea that actually places are brands, and we need to identify that actually what does a brand actually do. Brands have opinions, brands have a role to play in thinking about what their view of the world is, meaning that consumers kind of align with them or not. And if we take shopping centres, retail parks, maybe that's high streets. I recently did a post about the Oxford Street brand. They have a role to play in how they keep their audience engaged. And that could be through stereotypical shopping experiences, but it also could be through what the keynote previously alluded to was serendipitous moments. And what we believe is that kind of convergence between offline and online is driven by these serendipitous moments, regardless of whatever this generation C are kind of experiencing. But one of the most important things within this is around understanding the cultural kind of thread of our audience, should we say. And what we've done is we've actually developed a tool which allows brands in any single location around the world to understand what their consumer is truly feeling. And I mean that in terms of sentiment. And we can take any epicenter around the world, major cities, towns, even down to a postcode. And we can do up to a 6-mile radius scrape of social media sites, review sites, and even plug in credit card data. And what we can understand from that is the cultural understanding of our audience. What are they interested in? What's their buying power? What's their interest? What's their behaviours? Also, down to details of what's the colour they're engaging with the most. Where are they potentially going to vote in the next election? What does that look like in terms of the latest bands they're listening to? Imagine that as cultural information for any single placemaking brand, or brand in general, to use and utilise of how they position themselves within the audience. And that, of course, is going to be, if we interrogate what spaces and experiences become, of course it's going to be about sale, of course it's going to be about driving people online or fulfillment of purchase. But ultimately these brands have a role to play of understanding how they become culturally relevant to their audiences, meaning that we should be shifting from talking about our products, talking about our experiences in store, to actually understanding how we use that as a platform, shifting from product to platform to understand how we unite our audience, how we engage with them in an interesting way and serve a kind of a purpose in their lives beyond just what we sell. So of course, experiential is huge, and that will encourage what word of mouth recommendation looks like and social sharing. But I think also brands have a role to play off the physical experience in the digital realm to understand, how they share their opinion.
I think it's incredibly powerful. What you've just said is really quite mind-blowing when you think about it. Getting a real understanding of what people are thinking, doing, saying within a 6-mile radius. I mean, talk about hyper-targeting and hyper-personalizing messages. The brands that you work with that are already experimenting with these technologies are so much further ahead because they're using data, at their disposal. Hannah, I'd like to come to you. Same question. Just, we had this really interesting conversation, actually, where we talked about property as a platform. And of course, that, naturally evokes a sense of, experience. Tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that and what experiential means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been doing a lot of work about how we talk about property at all, and property is essentially a platform like TikTok or Instagram, and essentially the value is driven by having people there in exactly the same way. It's almost the same business model if you look at it like that. Post-pandemic, we did a lot of looking at the spaces that we actually have and whether they're fit for purpose anymore. You think there was a huge expansion during the kind of 90s and noughties in terms of mass chains absolutely everywhere. But kind of conducting this analysis post-pandemic, we found that 52% of all the places in the UK have too much retail. So there's too much supply for the demand that's there. And then that triggered us to have another conversation about, okay, well, what isn't in these spaces? So we ran another study where we looked at whether our high streets, our city centres, our towns have enough of the other things that people need to actually live there and thrive. And actually only 77 places out of 6,000 that we looked at had enough of the kind of services, had enough of the green space, the housing needed for the right demographic that was there. So I think experience is making sure that the place is fit for the people that live there. And yet we were quite startled by what we found, and that a lot of places aren't at the moment. And there's a big correction that needs to be made across the board, I'd say.
Yeah, really fascinating. And, coming to you, Olaide, about this, when we think about experience, we think about the space around us. And of course, I know as a B Corp registered or accredited business, you really do think about community in a way which includes everybody in that area, not just those that are developing it. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on the role that physical spaces have when it comes to the things that matter to communities, things like climate change and sustainability and those types of things?
Absolutely. I really like Koral's example of using data to understand what people are talking about. I think our industry doesn't do that well enough. And we tend to go out very early and ask questions. We use lots of digital tools to enable that to happen quickly and reach a broader range of people. Because I think it's really important if you're working or developing in a location to actually take the time to understand what the ambitions, what the aspirations are, what the needs are, and actually development is a vehicle to address those needs. You don't just stop with the building. Actually, what you're doing is creating the right infrastructure to help address those bigger issues. So, I love the example that Grigor and Kel mentioned earlier on around spaces that are created, and when people go in there, they have to spend money. And we're very passionate about creating democratic spaces. We've got to create spaces in developments, big or small, where it's absolutely free to use. You can come in, sit down, spend hours in there, and you're not going to be asked to leave. Because actually, we need those spaces. We need spaces for people across all different income levels, across all classes of life, to be able to come in and use those. So for us, the question that you posed was, how are we doing that? We listen. We take the time to understand what the issues are, but also actually what's the ambition and the aspirations of this place, and we're using whatever developments we're creating to address those bigger issues, because actually delivering social value and impact in places is the goal. The buildings are just a journey to do that. We've got to see our role, developers, architects, the whole professional team, as being part of delivering those long-term goals.
Brilliant. And, it really is important to see that community as part of the overall ecosystem, isn't it? Something that we have noticed is a lot of internet-born companies now are not just thinking about return on investment, but they're thinking about return on impact. So they're challenging themselves with causes and other factors which are equally as important as making money. Of course, financial sustainability is really important for any business, but there are so many more important factors than just making money. And I think that's a shift we're going to start to see with Gen C and certainly Gen Z and already Gen Alpha are starting to display those types of characteristics.
I think it was expressed in the example. People are a lot of people are values driven, and decisions are being driven by your values, whether it's what brand you use, whether it's what home, who your landlord is. That's really important to people. So actually, if my value systems are driven by social purpose, sustainability, and climate change, I'm going to look for brands that align with that, and I want to make sure that they're aligned with my values. So we see that a lot. We're seeing potential commercial occupiers are asking us a lot more questions around what I want to be net zero by 2030. I need to make sure that you as a business is aligned with me, and that's really important for us. Similarly, before we enter into a commercial contract with professional teams, we're asking them to sign up to specific social value commitments in the areas we're working with. We're saying, we'd expect you to employ someone on a paid work experience. We'd expect you to have an apprentice. We'd expect you to do this, because for us, that's a commitment we've made to that location. We expect our team who are working with us to also sign up and be aligned with that. So having values, I think, is really important. It's certainly come out from Generation C, and I think that is influencing a lot of the existing business and brands to also follow that way.
Amazing. Hannah, would you like to elaborate? Are there any patterns that you're seeing as far as this is concerned?
Yeah, definitely. We've done a big kind of UK-wide survey on exactly this recently. We found some really interesting trends. We asked what brands Gen Z specifically now think they align with or don't align with, and the results are really, really fascinating. So some of the brands that came up for brands they kind of resonate with, M&S was a big one, which was really interesting, and I don't know whether that links back to the Planet B commitments that they made a long time ago, and how that's carried through in terms of their reputation. Nike was another really interesting one that came up. Back when I was in school, Nike was sometimes used as an example of how globalization could be taken a step too far. They have totally transformed their reputation in that region. They're seen as investing in the local communities, investing in sports centres for communities that need it. So that was really interesting. On the flip side, you saw Nestle. Nestle was the brand that they disagreed with the most. And that, I was trawling through the internet trying to find out why that could possibly be. And there was something in the news about 10 years ago which shows that Gen Z do their research, and they're really actively looking for, right, if I'm going to invest in this kind of brand, I need to make sure that they've got the credentials to match. And that kind of level of research was really astounding for us. So I completely agree with everything you say there. We're going to, as this generation moves into kind of the biggest cohort of working people, we are going to see massive shifts in terms of consumer-driven attitudes.
Koral, what are you seeing in this space, linking to what the guys have just talked about?
It's interesting you mentioned Nike. For me, I think you're right. Nike have completely transformed their business, but that's because I think Nike have understood what their view of the world is. And it's funny, I had this conversation with someone who used to work there, and they had their sustainability infrastructure set up in the early 2000s, knowing that this was on the zeitgeist of what was going to come in the next few years, and understanding when to plug that communication into the ether, let alone then what that looks like for equality. Understanding that a brand like this sells sports products, but can flex and understand their opinion on equality, sustainability, whether that's picking up onto collaborations, whatever that looks like in terms of untapped audience. It's quite interesting in terms of their role. Now, where they're going to win is understanding that nearly 50% of Gen Zs feel more themselves online than they do in real life. If we know that as a premise, then actually I think it is a responsibility of brands to explore what that looks like online. And I don't necessarily mean just, what they call it, Web 2.0. I mean Web 4.0, so Web 4. Of understanding actually what that looks like as decentralized platforms. What is the role of brands, especially when we think about place? One of the best examples I can think of is something that we were talking about earlier, is Changi Airport in Shanghai, of how they've actually understood that, of course, they're a destination, they are obviously somewhere that you take your flight, but actually to have a destination that people can resonate with as a younger generation on a platform that is completely unknown to the vast majority of us, of understanding how they then gamify their experiences, what that looks like in terms of NFTs and thinking about value. How do they gamify their experience to interact with a new kind of audience? And the role of the airport for this new consumer is completely changing as they grow and as they earn more money. So yeah, I think there's some really amazing examples of brands and how they operate online, depending on the consumer. Just to add one more as well within that, is obviously within this kind of new platforms like Decentraland, for example, you've got brands that are already interrogating and thinking about their role on these decentralized platforms. So we can take Domino's as an example. Domino's have created an online store, pretty much like a kind of experience that your avatar can walk into. And there's lots of other brands experimenting in this space, like Gucci, Nike have done some bits as well. But I thought Domino's was quite interesting because ultimately what a Gen Z consumer could do, let's say, or anyone who's got a caricature on Decentraland, could walk into a Domino's store, order a pizza, and it gets delivered physically. So suddenly, even Domino's are starting to blur the lines between the role of physical and digital and what that looks like as an experience that can kind of almost transcend between this new kind of consumer. And I think, interestingly, that interrogates even the role of what does a website become. Ultimately what they've done is they've created a website that your character can live, not only explore. So there's some really interesting examples within that.
I'm going to come back to you on that because I think there's some really fascinating points there that links to the question that we're addressing in this on this panel. But Eloise, just from your perspective when it comes to community and sustainability, I know there's some really interesting work that you guys are doing about thinking how you bring element of luxury from the inside of stores outside. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, no, of course. I suppose in terms of welcoming people onto the estate, Chelsea, there's obviously an affiliation of the wealthy demographic nearby, and Sloane Street has the luxury brands. However, we really do feel that we've created spaces that are welcome for everybody in terms of a range of price points, the King's Road, Pavilion Road, and the community that's fostered there. The Sloane Street Regeneration Project, which is completing next year, at the end of that, the pavements will have been widened throughout the whole street, and 100 trees will have been brought out onto the street, so that it's exactly as you're saying, the luxury from inside the store is replicated in the entire area of the estate. And I think it's really important to us that there's a real connection and not that it's not feeling so binary. I think it's also something to do with community that we've been really looking into with all of the brands we're speaking to, not just the retail businesses, but our office tenants as well. When they talk to us about their community and sustainability credentials, really getting to the bottom of exactly what they're trying to say and looking into it as well, doing our own research, making sure they're true to their word throughout the whole product line and the supply chain is always really important to us. A lot of the time we're speaking to people who are true to their word, but it's not always as consistent. I think in terms of community as well, and what you were saying earlier, there are brands who are creating online communities, and that's something we're finding really fascinating. So Varley is a lifestyle athleisure brand who just opened their UK flagship on 110, 112 Kings Road. And you, again, like we were mentioning, you can go in, there's sofas, you can feel like you are part of their club. You join the Varley community, and there's another element to being part of a different community as opposed to just the tangible one, which we know that the brands we're working with all think is a huge priority, understandably, which is brilliant to see.
Absolutely, and I think the examples that the guys have been talking about is really illustrating the shift from retail being, a space that you go to transact. You can do that so much easier online now versus actually going to these places that make you feel a certain way. And it's places where retailers are now encouraging dwell time. They want people to come and stay, not for 5 or 10 minutes, but actually for an hour or so. Because that presence, of course, is the best way to capture their attention and showcase whatever propositions they have. On the flip side, we're seeing different realities emerging. So, we're all aware of what we call RR, or real reality. And then, of course, we've got augmented realities and virtual realities and merged realities and all these new ones popping up. But one thing which links back to what Koral was talking about is we're starting to see something called shared realities. This is where we're getting physical spaces that are overlaid with digital objects. Now, those digital objects could be a person, which are activated through your smartphone. And there's a company in China right now called Silicon Intelligence. They've produced something like 400,000 clones of influencers online. And their aim by 2025 is to have 100 million clones of real influencers who are running on autopilot. Their job is basically to sell goods to an audience, sort of QVC style, on full automation. And it's absolutely insane, the amount of revenues these guys are doing. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Lipstick King. Is anybody familiar with the Chinese influencer, the Lipstick King? No? So this is a 20-something-year-old beauty influencer. He sold last year $2.9 billion worth of beauty products in 8 hours on live stream, which is just insane. And you think, well, what's the role of physical retail then? Why do we want to go out there if businesses can save a ton of money on their physical assets and just stream everything? It changes the dialogue between the physical and the digital and vice versa. Koral, just touching upon what you mentioned a moment ago, you were talking about the metaverse in effect and these alternate realities like Decentraland. Do you see them having a role? Because of course the noise has really petered down from the point when Meta changed their name to what they did. And what are you seeing there? What role do you think these virtual realities have going forward?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer what role they have to play. However, I can talk about it from a point of view where brands can explore. And I think it's really important that a brand has a mindset of exploring what that can bring. But it's interesting you said about influencers, and I think I kind of challenge it a little bit myself, and obviously the numbers challenge me. But I think at the same time, it's like just cloning an influencer. Actually, one of the reasons the influencer is at that kind of level of influence is because of the personality, is because a Generation C in this context can associate themselves with them, whether they believe them, whether they understand their opinion, their tone of voice, what their view of the world is. And that is the most amazing thing about the role of influencer. Now, I'm very opinionated about influencers. I think some brands see them as the solution to everything. However, they are a modern form media channel. That's what they are. And if brands, places do not think about how we utilize them, then we can't speak through them. And I use that phrase, purposely. How do we speak through our audience, not directly to them? And ultimately, what we have to do as brands is give them the tools in order to allow what this looks like as speaking through our audience. And it's interesting you just question the role of physical retail in this context. Actually, it's quite interesting to understand how stores then become maybe broadcast hubs. How they become congregation areas for followers to meet their influencers as they're talking in real time. And also then live streaming that to think about online and international audiences. But that is the role, and I keep on talking about brands, but I mean places at this point, shopping centres, retail parks, whatever that looks like, because I think there is a role and responsibility to understand how that brand deals with influencers. What are they in terms of their immediate circle of influencers that they engage with, that they invite into the space, that they know how to activate. And that's why we've come at it from an angle of data understanding. We know our audience as a place better than anyone else should do. Not defined based off of our retailers, not defined based on the brands that we have in our space, based on the fact that we know our area, we know what resonates and what culturally interests our area. So we should be thinking about the influencers that we should be engaging with. And I think we get caught in a trap as shopping centres, as retail parks, of where we don't believe our brand is as important as the retailers in our spaces. And I think that dynamic has to change. They are renting from us. They are leasing spaces from us. We need to think about our role within that space and understand how we take their kind of opinions and the things that they sell, and put it into the context that becomes relevant to our audiences. Now, something that Eloise just kind of cottoned onto and mentioned, which I thought was really quite interesting, was the role that social first brands have. And actually, when you start putting social first brands into spaces, they automatically bring their own community. So I start thinking that's part of a metric system that letting agents start going to looking at what, beyond the product, beyond a brilliant service, what else are they bringing to our space? Because ultimately that's a media platform. They are advertising out to maybe thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people about their shop in our place that they're renting from. And I think that's super, super powerful.
It is indeed, yeah. One of the most interesting physical locations, and it's not a retail store per se, it's actually a piece of nation branding, and that is Japan House on Kensington High Street. I don't know if anybody's been to it, but for me, it's one of my favorite places to visit. And it's just a brilliant example of Japan having this tone of voice about having relevance, but doing it in a very analog way. There are almost no screens in that place. Everything is printed. Even if there's a beautiful knife they're selling there, they've printed on a bit of paper a little map of Japan, and there's a dot that shows where in Japan this knife has come from. And there's a little story behind it. The origin story of that particular craftsman that's produced that object. And then, of course, they're showing the best of what the brand is. It's, they have a gallery which attracts a huge, varying demographic of people.
And I think that's the role.
Yeah.
I think we talk about this heavily digitalized world, which is not an issue. But I think when you have physical experiences, the depth that you can go to is what you should prioritize. This is not a fleeting, I'm clicking on 15 videos and I'm watching 15 videos in an hour. Actually, I'm coming into Japan House and I'm spending time, I'm spending quality time, I'm engaged, I'm not distracted. And I think that's the power that you can create in a physical environment. That's why they don't compete, because the physical environment gives you the quality of time with your consumer. You get your brand values are communicated in a compelling way rather than fleeting. And I think that's the power of physical environments.
And I think also what Japan has to do really well is they engage all of our senses. It's not just what you see and hear, but you can taste, Japan in the restaurant and everything else. Fascinating space.
Sorry to speak up. It reminded me of the example about the 15-minute city, and I think what we are seeing is in that rise of that increased digital. We're all heavily digitalized anyway. We are seeing this increase in this requirement to check out. We want the spaces where we can take a break, where we can get away from it all and have a little bit of quiet. And we're certainly seeing that. We're delivering commercial, residential, mixed-use schemes. We're seeing much more requirement to create those types of quiet spaces, the spaces that aren't, that the distractions are minimized, or I can actually have a bit of time without that. So as much as we're seeing, we're all very comfortable in digital world, we definitely do need that checkout space.
We do. But
yeah,
I think
just to pick up on that point, something really interesting you saw was the age group that was most likely to request quiet seating areas within their local high streets or shopping centres or whatever were Gen Z. So they're the ones that actually do need that out time, as you say, because it's a lot, and life is very distracting, and you've got a lot of information coming at you all the time, and so they are 100% seeking that.
It's interesting, we did some work in Bristol, we're doing some work in Bristol, and we did some research with different generations, and exactly right.
Yeah.
And we didn't assume that, we just assumed that older generation might want seating and the traditional things you'd think, and actually the younger generation, actually the requirements are changing. They want the space to just sit down and relax and get some downtime, certainly.
And I think what you've both highlighted there is, we have to be prompted. We need to put in these tools that enable us to be able to take those breaks and to, take a respite from the digitally connected world. I want to open it up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions on what we said? There's no booze, so that's a good thing, right? Or not? Does anybody have any questions?
Hi there, my name's James Cons, I'm Managing Director of Leslie Jones. I've got a question, I suppose. I mean, I have 2 Centennial daughters, so much of what you said resonates. That happens in my house. My challenge to you, I suppose, is it the same in Barrow-in-Furness, in Kirkby, and other places around the UK, where people may not have the same access that we've just been describing?
That's a really good question. I mean, from a regional perspective, what are you guys seeing and hearing?
I think it depends on what we're talking about. Do you mean specifically digital attitudes there?
No, I mean everything that's just been discussed. You know, the first example was someone going off to Portugal to spend 2 months. They live in Greenwich. It's a completely different life to someone who might be serving pizzas in Kirkby.
From a digital perspective, and certainly analysing sentiment across the country, what we've observed is the way people are consuming digital content is quite universal, actually beyond borders. Koral, maybe you can elaborate on this.
I totally agree with that, where that sentiment of that question is coming from, and actually on the periphery of thought from a lot of landlords to an idea of actually how do we level up experience in outer main city environments. Now, we're working and have created a co-working brand, a co-working space brand, with one of our clients, Legal in General, who are up on the stage. And ultimately what that role is to do is how do you offer a WeWork type space, a really forward-thinking co-working space that's also about entrepreneurship and an encouragement of a certain mindset, and how do you input that into towns that aren't necessarily kind of hustle and bustle, big city centres, and often where a lot of investment is made. And it's quite interesting to even analyse then the role of the brand in that space and what that brand has to do. And you're right, the content kind of consumption is ubiquitous. They're all engaging with the content that we're putting out there. But also I think the kind of delight that your local shopping centre is thinking about locality, thinking about co-working. And I think the responsibility ultimately lies within the people who own the actual assets, to then think about the mechanic of their brand, of how they then talk about that and engage an audience to make it relevant.
And I think a good example of that is Unity Place, which is owned by Santander, just outside Milton Keynes Station. That opened this week, I think, and the ground floor is exclusive to the public. So anybody can walk in, use it as a hot desking space. They can have food trucks. Maybe you know more about this than I do. But that's a fascinating example of how regionally, you know, a bank, you know, Santander is including the local community into that dialogue and thinking beyond, you know, what's exclusively available in London. Question here, the front.
Hiya. As a millennial, the whole digital thing scares the hell out of me. However, coming from a local perspective, independent retailers, talking about everything you've talked about, the Domino's thing, the Gucci, you know, the online experiences, are you worried that the high street and independents are going to fall even further behind and the high streets are going to struggle even further because they don't have the funding to do anything like that?
To jump in just from a asset management perspective on, you know, as I mentioned, we have a range of different occupiers and a range of different price points. On the King's Road particularly, there's much more diversity, and that's actually something we seek out. So we have a huge push that we're doing internally and anyone we're meeting with to reach out to these community brands, these creative concepts, you know, pottery cafes, bookshops, event services, because we see the benefits that brings and for the community. And so if anything, there are areas of the estate that we are specifically targeting those occupiers for because we can feel exactly why that's needed. And it's, you know, it's a residential area and the residents are there and they have their say, and that's a huge important part to us on the estate. And it's where you get a real diversity of providing the customer service a completely different day in their customer journey. And you can go for lunch and you can shop in a high-end store, but then you can go to a more independent store. We actually prioritise brands where it's their first ever store. Businesses where they've had a pop-up and then we convert to their first ever store. That's actually what we're trying to do majority of the time over a brand that's got 5 other stores in the UK, exactly for that reason.
My answer to that is I think we are going to go through a shift and we are seeing it now, of where shopping destinations, high streets, need to become as localised as possible, need to become as relevant to that local audience as possible. Long gone are the days of cookie-cutter retail. And I think actually what we need to be challenging is identifying actually how do high streets, how do shopping destinations start adapting to local needs. Now, you just said you're an millennial and that kind of digital learning scares the hell out of you, but actually, if you think about it, if based off of data scraping and this tool that we alluded to, it's so much more powerful than surveys and focus groups and understanding actually that people often give their best answer. What we're truly understanding is how do we make high streets and shopping destinations truly personalised to these locals, but we can take a unit and identify, right, based off your existing tenant mix, based off the interest of the consumers in your area, based off their sentiment, here are the top brands that you need to be putting in there because you haven't got an offer that appeases them at the moment. So suddenly it starts automating it. And I agree, I think a human element is super important. But it's that kind of cross-pollinating between data capture and data learning into then commercial offers and experiences and brands who are social first that can start kind of making it more relevant to local audiences.
Great. On that point, do we have time for one final question? Or yeah, we do.
Hi, Ibrahim from Portland Design. I think this is a really interesting issue about assuming that people in the regions and smaller towns don't have the same aspiration or indeed don't have the same preferences as people in London and Liverpool and Manchester. What we've got to see is that this is a massive generational shift. That was the case in the past. This is the first global generation. They have access to every brand and every idea around the world. And before first time ever in history, they are able to start their own businesses at minimal cost very easily. They are engaging with social first brands. I think the idea that our regions are different in terms of our audience in those regions are different in their preferences is not relevant, and we ignore them at our peril.
I totally agree with you, and thank you for making that final statement, actually, because I think anyone that's distinguishing the difference between the physical and the digital are in the wrong mindset, I believe. I think, we need to be thinking as these channels being one. It's just a different access point and a different experience they may offer. On that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for the panel, and thank you to Revo and the audience here. I hope that helped, and if anyone's got any questions, please grab any of us on the way out. Thank you.